intended to. I'm thrilled to welcome our Power panel. We have Christine Bone from the University of Manitoba Libraries and Brett from the University of Winnipeg, who will be kicking things off. They'll be followed by Sharon and Sheila from the University of Alberta Libraries. So as I said, we'll pause midway through the presentations for questions and also take questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to get this slide out of the way. And I'm going to turn things over to Brett and unmute him.
Hi. Okay. Thanks, Marilee. Thanks very much for this opportunity to share our project with colleagues from around the world. We hope that our work can serve as a resource, or at least a source of inspiration for the decolonization of library and archival practice in your region. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are coming to you today from Treaty 1 land in the heart of the Métis Nation. We would also like to acknowledge that much of our presentation today has been excerpted from a paper Christine presented at the 2016 IFLA conference and from an upcoming publication of ours in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. I'm going to begin by providing the context surrounding our project before discussing our process, including the consultation process that we engaged in with Indigenous communities. We'll then turn things over to Christine, who will provide greater detail about the changes we proposed to the main database's subject terms relating to Indigenous people and culture, and why we decided to implement the fast derivation of LCSH. I'll then return to briefly discuss how our work is being implemented in the database. So first of all, let me briefly provide you with a little history about our project. Among the stated goals and objectives of the Association for Manitoba Archives is to promote a better understanding and increased public awareness among Manitobans of the role and uses of archives, and to enhance the quality of service provided by archives and archivists to the communities they serve in Manitoba by promoting standards, procedures, and practices in the establishment and management of archives. To this end, the AMA implemented the Manitoba Archival Information Network, or MAIN, an online database of standardized descriptions detailing the documentary heritage found in archival repositories throughout Manitoba. Powered by the Access to Memory, or ATOM software, and hosted by the software's developer, Artifactual Systems, MAIN improves the discoverability and accessibility of the province's archival descriptions by providing centralized search and browse capability via simple keywords or through more advanced search parameters. In 2013, Library of Congress subject headings were imported into MAIN in an effort to enforce consistency in format amongst its 37 participating repositories and eliminate redundancy in the system's existing subject headings. The feedback the AMA received following the announcement of the completion of the project was generally favorable. However, one AMA member astutely noted the problematic history librarians and archivists in Canada have had with LCSH when attempting to describe resources created by or about Indigenous people. Consultations with librarians at the University of Manitoba, including Christine, echoed that opinion, and a literature review reinforced it further. As a response to this criticism, the AMA formulated a working group in late 2013 to explore this issue further within the context of MAIN. The terms of reference of the AMA MAIN LCSH working group are threefold. Devise and implement a strategy to replace LCSH and MAIN that are considered culturally insensitive to Manitoba's Indigenous people with terms that more accurately reflect their identity. 2, ensure that the AMA does not perpetuate the culturally insensitive legacy of LCSH via the descriptions in MAIN. And 3, ensure that the archival descriptions in MAIN remain highly accessible and discoverable by using standardized subject terminology. Composition of the working group included individuals knowledgeable about the classification of Indigenous cultural heritage, as well as representation from Manitoba's First Nations and Métis communities. And here we see the members that were part of our working group, past and present. To begin the project, members of the working group familiarize themselves with the relevant scholarship along with similar Indigenous subject vocabulary projects being undertaken in Canada, primarily those of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs Resource Centre and the Weewa Library at the University of British Columbia. The working group also analyzed LCSH to find as many headings as possible that could be candidates for change. These were categorized into broad patterns, as well as a list of dozens of miscellaneous terms that needed to be addressed individually. As well as changing headings, the aim was also to add any relevant terms not extant in LCSH. Christine will provide more details about these patterns and terms in a few minutes. Over a period of 2 years, the working group discussed and debated and eventually made final decisions on terms for implementation. A spreadsheet was then created reflecting these decisions that mapped every affected subject heading to its corresponding new term. The final document contains 1,093 changed or deleted headings and 120 new headings. The group also composed a short list of guidelines to help archivists make decisions about how to use terms we thought might be confusing. For example, Métis identity is a controversial concept in Manitoba. Some Métis leaders believe that only those belonging to the distinct Métis cultural group should be considered Métis, while others argue that anyone with both Indigenous and European ancestry are Métis. Our guidelines recommend that archivists let the resource being described self-identify. The guideline states that if the resource specifically makes mention of Métis or Michif, then the term Métis should be used. Otherwise, the broader term Indigenous peoples mixed descent should be employed. Although there was Indigenous representation on the composition of the working group, we were cognizant throughout the process of the necessity of consulting with Manitoba's Indigenous population to ensure that they were engaged in this process and that their opinions were respected and incorporated into our final recommendations. Separate consultation strategies were created for Manitoba's First Nations and Métis peoples. These strategies identified reasons for consultation, principles of consultation based on respect, inclusion, transparency, accountability, and privacy, when consultation should occur, methods of consultation, and contact information for the appropriate organizations. A survey was determined to be an appropriate method of consultation owing to its ability to reach individuals with accessibility issues and those in remote locations. The survey was intentionally brief and asked respondents to self-identify their community and language before asking for approval on patterns of terms identified by the working group. The survey concluded by providing an opportunity to submit comments on additional or alternative terminology that should be considered by the group. 45 First Nations communities in Manitoba, as well as 24 First Nations and Métis organizations in the province, were contacted by email, telephone, or fax and asked to complete the survey. Although the response rate of 14% was considered low, the feedback received in the completed surveys was overwhelmingly positive and encouraging and allowed the group to feel comfortable continuing on, knowing that it had support from the local Indigenous population. Further consultation occurred with Indigenous and non-Indigenous archivists and librarians at conferences and with AMA members. Again, the feedback we received was overwhelmingly supportive of the work of the group. And now I'd like to pass things over to Christina.
Hi, I'm going to talk about some of the specific changes that we made. The problem in LCSH that most people are most familiar with is the word Indian in the subject headings, Indians of North America, and so on. This also affects the largest number of individual subject headings in LCSH that we dealt with. There was much debate about what to do about this, and the solution that we came up with was to change every Indian heading for all of every broad Indian heading for the peoples of the Americas to its Indigenous equivalent. So as you can see in the examples there, Indian architecture was changed to Indigenous architecture. Indians of Mexico changed to Indigenous people, subdivided by Mexico, and so on. What this did, I'm just going to show you a chart here. The top diagram there is the current terminology and structure in LCSH, with Indigenous Peoples Canada being the broadest level, and then there being 3 categories below that: Inuit, Métis, and Indians of North America. And then from Indians of North America, the individual groups of people. Historically, I think the terminology around Indians of North America has been the one that's most debated, and wanting to replace it quite rightly with something more current and appropriate, such as First Nations. After much discussion in the group, though, we decided to flatten the structure completely, as you can see in the bottom part of that chart, removing the intermediary heading entirely and not replacing it with First Nations or anything else. So there's one broad heading, Indigenous Peoples, and then every individual group, including Inuit and Métis, come below that. There are implications to this, both positive and negative, which affect both information access as well as socio-political implications. Overall, I'm not going to go into the details because it's quite a complicated conversation. If you're interested in that part, please ask during the Q&A, or you can refer to the papers that Brett discussed at the beginning. We'll have citations to those at the end of our presentation. Overall, though, we thought that this change in the flattening of the structure was by far, would improve access in a huge way, and also reflected some socio-political realities. The other thing we did, Indians is not the only problem in a heading such as Indians of North America. The of North America part is also a problem because, unlike most LCSH, relies almost exclusively on using geographical subdivisions to denote geographic location. But the Indians of North America, of South America, and so on, inserted colonial European boundaries right into the terms describing the people themselves, and does not reflect, is really, really arbitrary. So, for example, the peoples of southern Texas are considered Indians of North America, the implication being that they have more in common with the peoples of Manitoba than they do with their very close neighbors considered by LCSH to be Indians of Mexico. This, of course, is not how people traditionally organize themselves. So for pragmatic purposes, we initially thought we might just change it to Indigenous Peoples of North America, but decided in the end it was important to pull that colonial boundary out of the name and convert it to a geographical subdivision. It could be argued that even using colonial geographic names in the subdivisions for Indigenous knowledge may not be appropriate, but because the main database, we needed to adhere to LCS structure, and so we compromised, and we're maintaining those in geographic subdivisions, but we're very glad to at least pull them out of the terms referring to the people themselves and that categorize the people themselves. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the implications of this in a library system because it's very complicated. Again, you can ask me at the end. This, of all of the changes we made, would be the most complex to implement in a library system where you're importing records from other places because of the idiosyncratic nature of the subject string order in LCSH. But again, I don't have time to go into the complexities of that right now. There are a whole group of changes we also made to Manitoba, headings affecting Manitoba peoples only. The reasons we limited some of these changes to Manitoba peoples only was, one, because we did not have the time or the resources to address these particular pattern changes for all the peoples of the Americas, and also we didn't want to do it for peoples who we were not consulting directly. So those changes there that you can see are ones we made for Manitoba peoples only. The first is that we removed the word Indians from the name of the group, so Cree Indians and so on became Cree. We also added names of groups of people that do not exist in LCSH at all. We changed some group names to the names that the people in Manitoba use to describe themselves. So the example there, Athabascan Indians, there may be peoples in Canada who refer to themselves using the word Athabascan, but the people in Manitoba describe themselves as Dene. So we changed all of the Athabascan headings to Dene, so Athabascan women became Dene women, and so on. Also for Manitoba peoples, we removed all of the mythology headings, so Cree mythology, Ojibwe mythology, and so on were deleted. the term mythology is can be very problematic in that it's often, for example, Judeo-Christian creation stories are generally given the social status of religion, whereas the creation stories of other peoples are described with less status as myth. So with the terms religion being available and folklore being available, we decided that the mythology terms weren't necessary and are more problematic than they're worth. For the more general term, Indian mythology, we changed that to spirituality, subdivided by Indigenous, which conforms to the other spirituality headings structure in LCSH. We also made dozens and dozens of miscellaneous changes that did not fall into any particular pattern. So there's some examples there where we changed the LCSH term to one that is more commonly used in Canada generally and Manitoba specifically. I'll just give you a minute to read those. We also added, as Brett said, about 120 terms that don't exist in LCSH at all, and there are some examples there. As Brett said, we did this whole project working on LCSH specifically, but by the end, the main database was really being bogged down. It was working very, very slowly because of all of the lengthy subject strings in LCSH. So in the end, we decided we would implement FAST headings instead. Most of you are probably familiar with FAST, but it essentially uses LCSH terminology, but using a different syntax, which is much more abbreviated. It does have sometimes one topical subdivision in a FAST heading, and we actually decided not to use those either. So we're only using single terms from FAST, and are hoping that that will speed up the main database significantly. Using FAST did not require us to revisit any of the theoretical work that we had done because, as I said, it uses the same terms, it's just a different syntax. Now I'm going to turn it back to Brett.
So a little bit more about implementation. This summer, the AMA board provided the funding required for artifactual systems to import the revised FAST headings in Maine and to map the existing LCSH headings to FAST. So it is anticipated that by the end of this year or in early 2018 that the work will be completed and Maine will feature subject headings that are more representative and respectful of Manitoba's Indigenous people, while subsequently increasing the performance and usability of the system. Librarians and archivists across Canada and around the world will be notified upon the completion of the work. So this will effectively end the continued involvement of the AMA Maine LCSH working group on this project. However, maintenance of the subject headings within Maine will be the ongoing responsibility of the AMA board. The subject heading spreadsheet will continue to be made available on the University of Manitoba's institutional repository MSpace, and feedback will continue to be welcomed by the AMA. The goal of the working group was to provide alternative subject headings for use in Manitoba's archives, and they are specific to that community. However, we are also aware that our work could be used by any number of libraries and archives around the world in developing Indigenous appropriate subject headings for their holdings. So we hope that those of you attending the webinar will do just that. Thanks for your time, and we are open to accepting questions now or after the presentation, after the next presentation.
Here's some citations to those papers. You can read my IFLA paper now. It's available there. Early next year, we'll have an even larger discussion of this project in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. And that link at the bottom there is the link to the spreadsheet of changes itself. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a quick question about the survey. Is that included in the published paper? The survey that you used?
The survey itself is not included in the published paper. There's a little bit more information about the survey. I do see that there's a request to share that. I'd be happy to do that if we have a forum for that, Marilee.
Perfect. So we can send that out with maybe a link to that with the link to the recording following when we're all wrapped up with this. That would be great. Another question is, are authority records in MARC being created?
No, Adam doesn't use MARC, and the main database also does not include references between terms, in other words, related terms and broader and narrower relationships. So if it were to, at some point, or if somebody were going to implement this and wanted to include broader and narrower relationships and create modify actual authority records, that would take a lot more work, obviously, and a lot more analysis. However, all of the changes we made were keeping the LCSH relationship structure in mind, so it is internally consistent that way. We had that structure in our minds with every change that we made.
Okay. And then one final question, and then I'm going to turn things over to the University of Alberta. So this is a question from Ruth Tillman, who asks, were there steps taken to handle issues of access to the internet in Indigenous communities? It's an issue I've seen discussed at times, even more so than rural U.S. areas, where, of course, there's also issues around access to the internet.
Well, with regards to the survey, we certainly had that in mind, which is why not only did we have the ability for people to respond to the survey online, but we also we made sure to be able to make specific contact with every single First Nation by phone, or I sent a few surveys via fax for people to respond. So yeah, it's definitely an issue. We did the best we could with the resources we had at our disposal. But in terms of accessing the system, we never really addressed that as part of our working group.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have a couple more questions, but we will we'll come back to them at the end. I want to be sure that we give some time for our colleagues at University of Alberta, so I'm turning things over to Sharon and Sheila.
Thanks very much, Marilee and Brett and Christine, and thank you everyone for joining us. So I'm Sharon, and I'm here with my colleague Sheila, and over the next few minutes we're going to provide some background on the work and recommendations of a recent University of Alberta Libraries working group. So we're much earlier in our process than Brett and Christine. So we're going to talk a little bit about that working group and the outcomes of that and where we are now and where we hope to go. So I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we're presenting from the University of Alberta today, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the First Nations and Métis peoples. And I'd also like to note that this presentation is a sort of revised version of a presentation we made at the recent NetSuite conference here in Edmonton. And before we get into the working group, I just wanted to spend a little time setting the stage just very briefly. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established in 2008 to acknowledge the residential school experiences, impacts, and consequences, a necessary first step in the process of reconciliation, which is committed to establishing new relationships between the First Peoples in Canada and settler Canadians that are built on mutual recognition and respect. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, as well as its 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. Now, educational institutions and the units within those institutions, including libraries, figure large in the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the important role they can and must play in advancing reconciliation in Canada.
So this is Sheila LaRocque speaking now. To further contextualize where we are in Treaty 6 territory and the diversity of Indigenous peoples, we need to further acknowledge the peoples of this area. So on the slides now is a map of the numbered treaties signed between Canada and some Indigenous peoples, as well as further delving into who has traditionally called the area that we now know as Alberta. So that covers 3 numbered treaty areas, so Treaty 6, 7, and 8. As well, this points to the fact that the national dynamic is not as static as we are often led to believe. And by treating our library systems as inflexible and unchanging, we are perpetuating these inaccuracies. So the University of Alberta, like many institutions, has committed to taking up these calls to action. The university is already actively engaged in numerous initiatives in response to these, including the opening of the Wekotowin Lodge at the Augustana campus, and the signing of a partner agreement with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and consultation on and development of an online Indigenous portal for UAL. So the University of Alberta Libraries, UAL, has a long history of engaging with Indigenous individuals and communities in partnerships such as the First Nations Information Connection, or FINIC, and in service provisions such as the Personal Librarian Program, and in professional placements such as the Indigenous Internship Program. So we are well positioned to take on these new Indigenous initiatives. This Decolonizing Description project is a continuation of previous work that has already been done and continues to expand as we enrich our relationships with Indigenous students and the libraries. And I'll pass it back to Sharon now.
So as Sheila mentioned, the University of Alberta Libraries has engaged in numerous initiatives with local Indigenous communities in the past, but in the fall of 2016, we struck a working group. We recognized that one area that we had never really examined very closely were our descriptive practices, cataloging and classification and metadata around Indigenous peoples and contexts. So in the fall of 2016, we struck a working group called the Decolonizing Description Working Group, and its charge was to investigate, define, and propose a plan of action for how the libraries, or UAL, can more accurately, appropriately, and respectfully represent Indigenous peoples and contexts through our descriptive metadata practices. Although the working group was small, in order to make sure that it could get its work done efficiently, the membership, which you can see listed on the slide here, drew from across the library system. So within bibliographic or technical services, public service, involved, of course, our Indigenous Initiatives librarian, associate university librarian, and one of our wonderful Indigenous interns. And so part of the work of the working group, of course, was a literature review. And so in reviewing literature, focusing mainly on academic libraries in Canada and the States, but also looking at other types of libraries, museums, and archives, as well as institutions in other nations with large Indigenous populations, such as Australia and New Zealand. We found several themes, some of which many of you may not find overly surprising. One of the themes, of course, the challenge of describing Indigenous materials with existing schemas, which are in many ways inadequate. The differences between Indigenous knowledge organization systems and Western-based knowledge organization systems. The importance of the social justice component and the moral component of fair representation of peoples in our metadata descriptions, and also the importance for relationship building in the creation of descriptive metadata. In a recent OCLC expert presentation, Kim Kristen said something that really struck us, and she said it's about, create relationships, not records. So those are some of the themes that we found when we were scanning the literature. We also did some initial consultations and conversations with others who are engaged in such activities, including Brett and Christine. So we had some conversations externally with other colleagues and institutions who've been working on these initiatives, many for much longer than we have, such as the University of British Columbia, the Association of Manitoba Archives, some discussions with Library and Archives Canada, as well as some conversations with vendors who we work with very closely, including OCLC, ProQuest, Backstage Library Works, etc. We also made sure that we had some conversations with our colleagues within the libraries, those colleagues from archives, digital repositories, and digitization, to understand their sense of how this might impact their collections, their repositories, and their services and particular challenges and opportunities that they saw. As well, we did a very small, informal survey of University of Alberta students and some alumni just to get their sense of the importance of fair representation in cataloging records and some areas they thought we might be able to improve on. The other thing, of course, that we wanted to do as part of this process was to get sort of a snapshot of what our metadata looks like currently. We wanted to look not only at the metadata, the catalog records in our ILS, but also at our local repositories, including our institutional repository, locally digitized collections, etc. And we used the wonderful work that Christina and Brett and their working group did to look specifically just at LCSH. So for this sort of snapshot of our metadata, we looked only at LC subject headings. We didn't look at many of the other vocabularies that are in use across our systems, many of which you see listed on the slide here. We know those are vocabularies that will need to be part of whatever process we come up with. But at this point, it was just to give us a sense of LCSH, for that's the one that's, of course, used most extensively. So using the list, the change or add list that Manitoba had come up with, we did a bit of a comparison with our ILS and repository data on matching headings. So within our ILS, at the time we did this, this was roughly May or June this year, we have just a little over 5 million titles. We found that we had just over 62,000 that had subject headings matching those in the Manitoba list, and of that, 9,100 or so unique headings. Within our repositories, of course, certainly a smaller number of titles to deal with, just over 91,000 objects. But we did find within that 6,200 with matching subject headings, and within those 365 unique headings. And this word cloud just gives you a sense of some of the headings that we came across, many of which Christine mentioned, things like Indians of North America, Eskimo, and so on. So many that are sort of known and understood to be problematic in our context. So that gave us a bit of a snapshot just to give us a sense of the potential scale of the challenge that we would be facing. So this spring, in June, our working group wrapped up its work and put forward a set of recommendations to our senior leadership team. These recommendations included that the libraries take a lead on working in collaboration with Indigenous communities and partners to develop revised subject headings reflective of the Alberta and appropriate northern context, that we engage an individual to coordinate and conduct consultation and outreach, which is the essential groundwork that's critical to the success of moving forward with a project like this. And then from there, that when we develop revised or changed headings, that we retroactively apply those to library resources, including records within our ILS and metadata applied to our local repositories and digitized collections, and that going forward the same subject headings then be applied to new content added to our library resources. And so these recommendations were all approved by our senior leadership team, and we have taken some initial steps towards meeting these goals, one of which, of course, is bringing Sheila on board as an academic library resident to work on this project for us. So I'm going to turn it over to Sheila to talk a little bit about where we are now and where we hope to go.
Thank you, Sharon. So it won't be technology or a new metadata process that solves a systematic problem like this one, but rather a renewal of our relationships. So as I've said before, the U of A has good relationships with some of our partners, but there's always room for gaining insight and widening our circles in order to truly have collections that are representative. And while this can be seen as being a time-intensive process, we've already spent a lot of time knowing that our systems are problematic without fully engaging in the ways that we operate. It took some time to entrench the ideas from the dominant culture and to become normalized, and so it's going to take some time for us to reimagine this as well. So what we've done so far is that we've identified 2 different test collections for this project to really get started with before we apply it across the board. So the first one is called Peel's Prairie Provinces, and that's a flagship U of A collection that began with the research and bibliography of our first Chief Librarian, Peel. The other is a very small print collection from ATEP, which is the Aboriginal Teaching and Education Program in the Faculty of Education. And so that is an important collection to really decolonize and really get to the heart of, first because it's a small, brand new collection, as well as by decolonizing the way that we educate our teachers, we really are taking a systematic approach to looking towards the future. So there are many things for us to consider when we're looking at the how part of this implementation process. Differences in formatting and metadata systems will all play a key role in how we implement these changes, and we would love to hear feedback on this. As well, the relationships that we have with community members will influence the tools and processes that we develop, whether they be in-house or through our vendor relationships that will allow for these discussions to permeate throughout the wider library world. In addition, things such as human resources and the financial ebbs and flows will also play a part of this project. Like we said, we're just at the very beginning stages of this project. We have a lot of great support right now, but we have to always prepare. As well, we also have to make sure that we take into consideration staff training for the ways that we change what we do right now. So there are some challenges within a consortial environment, particularly the interoperability with systems such as WorldCat and HappyTrust, different vendor aspects, workflow and tools that help both us at University of Alberta, but also others. So this is where we see a lot of potential for building up our partnerships with organizations such as OCLC, but others as well. And as well, there's a lot of opportunities within this project because we are at the beginning stage and because we know that this will take a lot of time. It's an ambitious and a large project, but by working together with key partnerships, both within Canada and outside of Canada, through partnerships such as the Canadian Federation of Libraries Associations, Indigenous Matters Committee, and other colleagues that have already begun this type of work, there are many opportunities that we see that we'll be able to work with. So part of just our closing thoughts is we know that it takes a long time to solve these systems and the ways that we've done things in the past, but we really resonated with this quote, and that if you want to see different results, do things differently. The title of our presentation, Uplifting the Whole People, comes from the first convocation address of our president when this university started. And really that's what we see this project as moving towards, is uplifting our whole people and really including those who not necessarily have been included in our libraries before. So thank you, everyone, for listening, and we really would appreciate any feedback and questions.
Thank you. Those were just such great presentations, and as expected, we have a number of thoughtful questions ranging from the technical to the social. So first, there's kind of a set of sort of technical questions, and I think this is for both the presenters. Are the outdated subject headings removed entirely from the records once they are replaced, or are they repurposed as keywords once new subject headings are developed? I'm curious if old subject headings are kept in the records to promote access continuity as newer headings are learned and incorporated on a larger scale. And then there's a related question, I think. I'd love to hear from both sets of presenters on the question posed in the current presentation, relationships to existing headers, keep and display, keep but shadow. So some comments from both sets of presenters on those issues.
This is Christine. In Maine, we did not keep the old headings. We're changing them all in the contributed archival descriptions. The reason for that is to take full advantage of what a controlled subject vocabulary is mainly good at, which is eliminating synonymy and using the one term per concept idea. We don't know that this would be the right decision for everyone, but we believe it was for this particular database. Go ahead, Alberta.
Thanks, Christine. This is Sharon. And that's a really great question, and I think Christine makes a really great point, and certainly we put that as a question in our slides for a very good reason, and because it still is a question. We haven't, because we're very early on yet, we look to the example from Manitoba, for example, and other places such as UBC, but we haven't really decided on that yet, and that's going to be part of our discussions and consultations and thinking through how this is actually going to be workable and sustainable in sort of the large interconnected systems that we have. And certainly, there is a sense that there are challenges and opportunities of both shadowing, taking out the old headings, putting in new headings. There's also some sense that there are learning opportunities and opportunities to not exclude those even within the community who may use older terms by keeping them in and so on. So I think from our point of view, it's still a question, and that'll be something that we'll be talking through with our community colleagues as well as with other colleagues within library systems and vendors and so on, just to really think how that is going to work in practicality.
This is Christine again. Aside from this AMA project, at the University of Manitoba, I'm trying to begin implementing some of this for the University of Manitoba Library Catalog too. I have accomplished one thing, which is that figuring out a semi-automated, let me back up. Our project with the AMA was a really good place to begin this sort of big change, because archives create all of their descriptions from scratch, and so they can kind of do whatever they want. And so using this for Manitoba Archives was a really good place to begin. The challenge that libraries have, of course, is that by far most of our metadata is created by other people and imported, sometimes in the hundreds or thousands of records at a time. So what I've done at the U of M already is using our library system software, we use ALMA there, is figure out a semi-automated way to isolate records with Indian headings, but which are not about India or the Indian Ocean or the Indian rhinoceros and so on, and adding a local subject heading, Indigenous People. So the original headings are still there and visible, but now if people search by the word Indigenous, they will find far more resources than they would have otherwise, and particularly opens up access to older resources where the word Indigenous is probably not included anywhere in the title or the description. So that's one thing we've done at U of M. But as I said, in my opinion, the biggest barrier for libraries is not so much the changing and the changing of the headings, but rather the isolating the records that need consideration. And I'm hoping that the project at the University of Alberta will help us all in that regard.
Thank you. There's another question. This was going back, I think this was posed during the presentation by our Manitoba colleagues. What about CSH? Are you looking at headings in CSH and any changes there?
For the AMA main project, we did not address CSH because we did not load CSH into main. We only loaded Library of Congress subject headings, now FAST instead. For those outside Canada, Canadian subject headings is an alternate subject heading thesaurus created by Library and Archives Canada, which does have alternate terms related to Indigenous peoples. The structure of it is the same three-tiered structure that Library of Congress uses, but I believe the only difference is the top level is Native peoples rather than Indigenous peoples. and that adds that additional alternate terminology, adds additional, I would say, confusion, although it's of best intention, adds additional confusion among users trying to figure out all these terms that they need to search in order to find things. But for our project, we did not address it directly because Maine does not have CSH in it.
If I could just chime in really quickly, at the U of A libraries, we certainly do use CSH, particularly in some of our locally digitized collections because it's a lot of Canadian content. And certainly, we did have some conversations with Library and Archives Canada, and they have in the past, as Christina alluded to, they've made changes to Canadian subject headings to update some of the terminology. And our understanding from the work of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, Indigenous Matters Committee, and Library and Archives Canada is that they're, going to work together and look at ways to address some of these issues with CSH kind of going forward. But again, it'll take some time, but we will be looking at those because we do use them and seeing what we want to do with those down the line. But again, it's very early on.
Thank you. There's an additional question, challenging. Have new and changed headings been submitted to LCSH so that everyone can benefit from these projects?
Well, we haven't contacted LCSH directly, but for the AMA project, we're trying to spread the word as wide as we can through, as we mentioned, I presented this project at IFLA last year, and Brett and I have a paper coming out in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. So hopefully somebody at LC will get wind of it if they haven't already and do with it what they will. I mean, ideally, obviously, changing the standard would be everybody's dream. Then we wouldn't have to take this on in a localized way. Although, again, LC would have to, I think, in order to do this properly, consult in a local manner as well. But obviously, it would be better for everyone if the standard can change, but that's beyond our control. I'm just hoping that they get wind of all of these projects that we're working on, including the CFLA committee, and work at what Alberta is doing, what we've done, and what lots of other people have done before us.
Thank you. I'm putting out a last call for questions, so we're coming up with only 10 minutes left to go. I don't see any more questions. I do have a question of my own, which is what is the role of linked data, or maybe more particularly identifying some of these subject terms, so turning them into identifiers rather than strings? Do you see potential for that, either easing the way for a transition, or just wondering how that has perhaps played into your discussions?
This is Brett speaking. It never really came up in our discussions with our project, but it's certainly an intriguing notion.
Yeah, this is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, sorry, please.
Yeah, so this is Sharon, and that's something we've been thinking about a little bit. And again, we're very early on, but really thinking about some of the potential for linked data in terms of using a URI and then having multiple, the ability to have multiple preferred labels that can be used in different contexts and so on. And so we've been thinking a little bit about the role linked data might play, and also thinking about, the initiatives that Manitoba has undertaken, and BC, and us, and other places across Canada, and thinking about, is there potential in linked data to develop tools and workflows that can be used to make working with enhanced or alternate vocabularies easier. And so we're really trying to think about what role linked data could play further down the line, and certainly talking to some colleagues elsewhere, they're thinking about the potential for linked data as well to perhaps enable some of these localized, contextualized labeling difference is easier to incorporate into systems where we do a lot of data sharing and so on. And also, just in some of the conversations we had with some of the vendors who were all very, supportive and very interested in what we were doing, and just noting that, from their point of view, when they're creating records and so on, they rely a lot on tools where they can go to find the appropriate heading or an alternative heading. And so, they just suggested that's something we need to keep in mind, that if we want them to apply different headings or to swap headings or whatever the case may be, that they'll need supports and tools as well, and so we can work together on that. So again, I think there's a place where a linked data, some kind of linked data technology may have some real potential.
Thank you very much. And I apologize, there was a question from before that I overlooked, which is, again, for both groups of presenters. Can you give more details on the Indigenous communities that you're working with? Are they university-based communities like students and faculty, or are they communities at large where the universities are located?
This is Brett. So our project isn't university-based. It's a project of the Association for Manitoba Archives. So we were very keen on making sure we consulted outside of the university environment. We had Indigenous consultation within our working group, as half of the members identify as Indigenous. We have spoken about our project with librarians and archivists across Canada and around the world, really. Christina and I have made presentations. Camille Callison, the Indigenous Services Librarian at the University of Manitoba, who is also a member of our working group, has spoken about the project at many of the national and international meetings that she's attended. And then we also wanted to make sure that what we were doing was what our intended audience wanted. So we wanted to make sure that we spoke to Indigenous communities outside of libraries and archives, who the users of the system, the people accessing the descriptions, to make sure that the work we were doing was actually desired by the Indigenous community. So we made a concerted effort to try and reach every single First Nation in the province, as well as the major First Nation and Métis organizations within Manitoba.
And just to answer that question from Alberta, this is Sheila speaking. So we've identified 5 different smaller colleges that we already have relationships with, as being our first foray into the consultation process, and then go from there. So those colleges are throughout Alberta, like surrounding major metropolitan areas, and then going out from there. So that's where we're at with our consultation process so far.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, so I think we'll take a moment to thank the presenters so much for your thoughtful presentations. And I also want to acknowledge that in an effort to be inclusive, you guys are repeating this at a different in a different time zone to reach more people. So I really want to applaud your efforts and your actions in getting the word out about your very important and path-breaking projects. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thanks also to the audience for your participation and your energy. I hope you all take this forward and think about how you can carry this work into your own work, and how this is going to play out in the future. So thanks to our Alberta and Manitoba colleagues, and we'll see you in a couple days, and we'll repeat this again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.